I've suggested before that the Yoga Vasistha seems to be wanting to bring the whole of Hinduism and perhaps even elements of other traditions within the perspective of self-enquiry. So we've had stories of the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana and so on, and all the stories of the gods are brought into it as well, all within the context of self-enquiry. And this includes the yogic elements of pranayama, although at times some of these elements tend to overshadow the teaching of self-enquiry. We've got a fascinating explanation here about how the individual arises from the Supreme Self. It's being expressed in terms of the cosmic person, the Virat. True to the perspective of self-enquiry though, it's well established that this is only a notion as well. Everything is essentially notional. This is what self-enquiry reveals, including the notion of the cosmic person, which is basically everything actually, everything regarded as a person. Just as the cosmic person has come to be manifest as this cosmos, even so have all things come into being, right down to the minutest atom. But in truth there is nothing large nor minute. Whatever notion arises in the self is experienced as if it were real. What this means is that everything we think of real is actually notional, including notions of large and small. This might seem like quite a fundamental distinction. Clearly something is larger than other things. Well, there's different ways of approaching this. Size depends on distance. That's clear. If something is smaller, it's often far away. We tend to think of the size as something as pretty well fixed. But the size of something depends on the distance. If it's further away, it's smaller. We say it's not smaller, it only appears to be smaller. Okay, if that's not very convincing, well, look into the theory of relativity. Here, the size of something depends on the speed it's moving at. This is a scientific story, scientific fact if you believe in relativity. The faster something goes, the smaller it gets. Also, the more massive it gets. I haven't checked my facts here, but I think that's the way it goes. Definitely its size changes as it gets faster. So size depends on speed. Scientific fact. We tend to want to fix the size so we can measure it. We can say, look, this is my height. But that's an abstraction. We think we're being physical, we think we're being real. But nothing is ever the same size. This book is probably only for you, although it's filling up the whole screen, it's probably only a few inches across for you. But you substitute that obvious fact for the abstract fact, the abstract scientific fact that this book is a fixed length. It's changing all the time. Its length is changing all the time. And that might just sound like clever wordplay, but that is actually what's going on. There is a scientific length which we can say doesn't change, but we've abstracted from the experiencing. We've got a notion of things, and you can feel the force of this. You can feel the force of how this has been substituted for the obvious reality. The obvious reality is its size is changing all the time, but we cannot accept that because we vehemently believe in the notion that its size is fixed. Its size is fixed. Even though from an obvious point of view, it depends on the angle, the size depends on the angle, it depends on the distance. From a physics point of view, it depends on the speed it's going at. But no, it's got a fixed size. We're not going to let go of that notion. This is how our notions become reality. Because you're not going to take on board what I'm saying here. You believe this has got a fixed size. You are not going to let go of that. You will cling to it. You will cling to this belief with your utmost being that things have got a fixed size. And this is what we're up against. In truth, there is nothing large nor minute. Size is notional. Whatever notion arises in the self is experienced as if it were real. And you experience the reality of that, don't you? You experience the reality that size is fixed. You're not going to let go of that. But if you can, I apologise and well done. It's a tricky one, isn't it? The mind arises in the lunar element and the moon is created by the mind. So the lunar element clearly refers to some yogic notion, some pranayamic notion, which gives rise to the mind. But the moon is created by the mind. So this is another notion that the mind creates. The mind creates all notions, all concepts, including yogic notions. In the same way, one jiva gives rise to other jivas. We've got notions of others. I have got a notion of me, I've got a notion of you, and so on. The wise consider jiva to be the essence in the sperm. Again, this is another notion, which is a physical analogy with what we're talking about, one thing giving rise to another. This principle operates on different levels. In it is hidden the bliss of the self, which it experiences as if independent of itself. I assume it's talking about the jiva here rather than the sperm. There arises in it its identification with the 5 elements for no apparent reason. We identify with the physical. There's no apparent reason for it. It's just happened. Yet the jiva continues to be jiva, not really limited by these elements. So the jiva here is in the sense of the cosmic self, or the absolute self, which is essentially free. It is inside and outside these elements and their composition, known as the body. But veiled by its identification with the elements, it does not see its true nature, even as a man born blind does not see his way. Emancipation or moksha is the destruction of this ignorance and the realization of the independence of the jiva from these elements and the ego sense. So we've got this intense identification going on with our notions. Notions of big and small, notions of physicality. This is what we have to look into, this is what we can inquire into, and realize that we can actually identify with what is doing the identifying.